Tonight you're stepping into a journey that history books never really told you about. A life so exhausting, so quietly brutal, that calling it heroic almost feels like an insult. Because long before the West became a myth of wagon wheels and cowboy hats, survival meant carrying an infant across mountains while guiding two overeager explorers who couldn't tell a beaver dam from a trail marker. This is the brutal, underrated reality of Sacagawea, and you're about to live it. If you're enjoying these strange and sleepy walks through history, feel free to like, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now tuck yourself in and prepare to feel the mud squelch beneath your feet. As you picture yourself trudging through that mud with aching arms, you soon realize there is one constant companion on this expedition that no map can protect you from. It is not the rivers or the snow. It is the endless whine of mosquitoes drilling into your skin. You're trying to nurse a baby who is barely 2 months old. His name is Jean-Baptiste, though most of the men will nickname him pompously, as if he were their mascot. But to you he is simply heavy, loud, and vulnerable. His wails attract the mosquitoes like a dinner bell. His tiny hands slap at them in futility, while your own arms are already covered in red welts. Now here is the reality. In the early 1800s, the American West was mosquito paradise. Wetlands stretched for miles, stagnant water pooled along riverbanks, and without nets or modern repellents there was no escape. Contemporary accounts from the Lewis and Clark journals mention swarms so thick they blurred vision and suffocated campfires. Sacagawea endured this while trying to feed an infant. Every bite risked infection, and malaria was always lurking, though not yet fully understood. The Corps of Discovery wrote more complaints about insects than about food shortages. One entry compared mosquitoes to a nightly torture, crawling into ears, nostrils and mouths while men tried to sleep. Imagine what that meant for someone carrying a child. No silence, no rest, only the persistent itch of survival. And then the food situation made it worse. Because mosquitoes thrived around the same water sources where the expedition drew its drinking supply, the men constantly risked contamination. Boiling helped, but fuel was limited, so every sip was flavoured with risk. For Sacagawea, this meant her milk supply depended on the same questionable water. Her body became the filter, and her baby's health was tethered to her endurance. Now pause and consider the absurdity. Lewis and Clark may have been charting rivers, sketching wildlife, and declaring discoveries, but Sacagawea was charting survival hour by hour. Imagine trying to explain to history that mosquitoes nearly ruined an expedition that spanned thousands of miles. But that is the truth. Without constant endurance, the swarms could have driven the party to collapse. At times, the solution was smoke. Fires were built to smother insects, filling camps with choking haze. The men tolerated it. Sacagawea had to cradle a child in it. Burning green wood created thick plumes that burned the eyes and lungs, and yet it was preferable to the alternative. There is no romanticism here, only the grim calculation of misery. The most biting irony is that mosquitoes followed them from the plains through the forests and even into the mountains. Journals note that in summer they were so relentless that hunting became almost impossible, with animals fleeing or collapsing in exhaustion under clouds of insects. For a party already living on meagre rations, this meant starvation hovered close. And again, who bore the weight of this reality? The woman forced to balance an infant while foraging roots, berries and herbs to fill the gaps the hunters could not. If you think this sounds like an exaggeration, consider that mosquito-borne disease shaped entire colonial ventures. In the Mississippi Valley, malaria cut down settlers by the thousands. Expedition doctors barely understood why fever struck, calling it ague or swamp sickness. They carried quinine bark, but rarely enough. For Sacagawea, the risk was doubled. If she fell ill, her child's survival would collapse immediately, and the men who depended on her translations would lose their bridge to local tribes. Think about that tension. One woman, one baby, and a swarm of mosquitoes standing between success and disaster. You could almost hear the buzzing just outside the canvas of a leaky tent. You can almost feel the welts rising on your skin. Now step deeper into that night. The baby finally sleeps, his breath uneven against your chest. But your own body refuses rest. Every itch jerks you awake. Every whine drills into your skull. You know tomorrow will bring another march, another crossing, another test of endurance. And still you lie there, wondering if the men scribbling notes by firelight will ever understand what it cost you to keep them alive. Sacagawea's strength is often painted as symbolic. In reality, it was biological. Every calorie, every drop of milk, every moment she resisted collapse meant the difference between progress and failure. History remembers the expedition's discoveries. It forgets the swollen arms, the sleepless nights, the mosquitoes that nearly drove a teenage mother to despair. And if you think the insects were unbearable, wait until you find out what happened when the food ran out, and the men turned to eating candles just to survive. And as you scratch at another mosquito bite, the real torment waiting in the shadows is hunger. Not the sort of hunger where you raid the fridge at midnight, but the kind that gnaws through bone and makes you consider things that were never meant to be eaten. Because on the core of discovery, food was both the greatest obsession and the greatest humiliation. You quickly learn that the frontier menu is as unforgiving as the land itself. The men boast of hunting, but wild game does not simply walk into camp each night. There are stretches where elk and bison vanish, where deer tracks fade, where fish evade the nets. And in those moments, desperation breeds creativity, or what they called creativity. You, Sacagawea, find yourself chewing things that hardly qualify as food. The journals of Lewis and Clark are filled with complaints and confessions about diet. They ate dog when offered by local tribes, they ate spoiled meat, they gnawed on animal sinew. But the most infamous resort came when fat and meat were gone entirely. They boiled candles, not decorative beeswax candles, but tallow candles made from animal fat. Imagine your dinner flickering faintly in front of you, then imagine blowing it out and swallowing it instead. This was not culinary innovation, it was survival with a greasy aftertaste. The irony is that candles had to serve double duty. They provided light in the night, warding off darkness and spirits in the minds of the men. Yet when famine struck, light became calories. A single tallow candle held hundreds of calories of pure fat. To the modern stomach it is revolting. To a starving expedition it was fuel. Now consider the absurd comparison. Today we count calories with apps, weighing every bite with guilt or pride. For Sacagawea there was no counting. Every calorie mattered, and every scrap of edible substance was consumed. It was not about choice, it was about function. Nursing a child meant you needed energy that did not exist, so you ate what was in front of you, whether it barked, buzzed, or burned. There were other meals to haunt your memory. Beavers were consumed with gusto, their fatty tails considered delicacies. The explorers described the texture as gelatinous, an early example of pretending something revolting is gourmet. Elk was treasured, but spoiled quickly without salt. When meat rotted, they sometimes ate it anyway. Stomachs churned, bowels rebelled, and yet the march continued. Diarrhea became so common it filled pages of the journals. A trip across the continent was accompanied by a constant, miserable soundtrack of digestive revolt. Foraging offered some relief. Sacagawea recognized edible roots and berries, which often saved the party from collapse. The camas root in particular was vital, though it had to be carefully prepared or it caused violent sickness. The men had no idea, but Sacagawea carried the knowledge of her people, knowledge that transformed poisonous plants into nourishment. Without her, their diet might have killed them before the mountains ever appeared. Still, even this expertise could not erase absurd mistakes. At one point the men gorged themselves on roots that were improperly cooked and spent days collapsed with cramps. It was a lesson that survival was not only about bravery, but about knowing which plant would sustain and which would betray. Sacagawea shouldered that burden while also carrying a child, and yet the men still marvelled more at their own discoveries than at their survival. They wrote pages about new birds and insects while eating rancid horse meat behind the fire. contradiction is almost comical. Science marched forward while their intestines staged a rebellion. The cold truth is that food dictated the expedition more than maps or courage. Where meat was plentiful, morale soared. Where bellies were empty, tempers flared, diseases spread, and hope shrank. This is the hidden skeleton of history. Exploration was not just about daring men with compasses. It was about whether there was enough fat to keep the fire going, whether a candle was burned for light or eaten for breakfast. And you, Sacagawea, lived it daily, nursing while hungry, foraging while tired, enduring while men debated. Every mouthful of questionable food carried risk. Parasites, bacteria, and starvation stalked every camp. Yet history remembers only the discoveries, not the nights when wax dripped down your throat in place of dinner. Close your eyes and imagine it now. A greasy candle stub sizzling in a pot, the smell of smoke clinging to your hair, the taste of animal fat thick on your tongue. You gag, but you swallow, because you must. This is how history was made, not with declarations, but with desperation. You soon realize that the lowest point wasn't until the expedition found itself in the grip of winter, where cold became an enemy sharper than hunger, and survival meant bargaining not just with the land, but with life itself, because hunger gnawed, but winter clawed. It sank into your marrow, turned your breath into ice, and laughed at every attempt to fight it off. The Missouri River froze, the wind howled through ragged tents, and the only thing thinner than the blankets was the patience of men already half broken. You, Sacagawea, carried a baby into this frost-bitten world. The weight of him never lessened, and in the chill he felt heavier still. Your body burned calories it did not have, trying to stay warm enough for 2 lives at once. The men cursed their numb fingers and stiff boots. You had no such luxury. You walked, you nursed, you endured. The Corps of Discovery faced a North American winter in 1804 that was among the harshest on record. Temperatures plunged below zero, ice-sealed rivers, and snow-buried supplies. The journals describe entire weeks spent huddled in huts at Fort Mandan, with the men growing gaunt and pale. Their clothes stiffened into armour of frost, and their shoes disintegrated under constant freezing and thawing. The absurd part is how unprepared they were. These men thought bravery could outpace winter. They imagined thick hides and roaring fires would be enough. Instead, they discovered that cold was not just a condition. It was an adversary. It cracked rifles, split lips, and froze ink in journals. Exploration ground to a halt not because of enemies, but because of the sheer cruelty of climate. Fire became sacred, but fuel was scarce. Wet wood smoked more than it burned, filling shelters with choking haze. Men coughed and wept, but clung to it anyway. Sparks died in the wind, leaving them to huddle together for warmth. Sacagawea's role was harder still. She had to keep her baby alive with body heat alone, knowing one slip in vigilance could turn him cold forever. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers, though the journals downplayed it. The explorers were too proud to confess weakness, but evidence lingers between the lines. Stiff joints, bleeding skin, and infections suggest cold injuries were widespread. Imagine trying to carry a canoe when your fingers barely bend. Imagine trying to write a scientific description of a plant while your ink turns solid. The irony is that even in this misery they documented. Lewis noted wind directions, Clark mapped terrain, and both described native assistance in keeping them alive. The Mandan and Hidatsa people supplied corn, beans, and squash, the true lifeline of the expedition. Without those stores, the Corps would have perished before spring thaw. History prefers to call this mutual exchange. In reality, it was dependence, and here lies the biting truth. Sacagawea's survival was tethered not just to her own endurance, but to the kindness of communities who owed her nothing. The expedition's legend often forgets this, polishing the story into one of heroic self-sufficiency. But the evidence is clear. Without Mandan food, without Sacagawea's translation and ties, the core of Discovery would have been a frozen monument along the Missouri. Still, even provisioned, cold cut deep. Nights meant stacking furs into makeshift bedding, pressing bodies together to trap heat. Privacy was abandoned, replaced by necessity, every breath condensed into frost that rimed the canvas overhead. Every morning began with scraping ice from blankets stiff with sweat. And then there was childbirth recovery. Only weeks before joining the expedition, Sacagawea had given birth. In the modern world, recovery means rest and nourishment. Here it meant carrying an infant through sub-zero marches, bleeding into frozen hides, and nursing with cracked skin in the open air. Her body was not healed, yet she had no choice but to act as if it were. This is where the absurdity becomes staggering. History calls her brave, but the reality was unrelenting biology. Hormonal shifts, physical strain, malnutrition, and constant cold made her body a battlefield. Yet while men collapsed from frostbite, she carried on, wrapped not in glory but in survival. Close your eyes and feel it. The icy wind cutting through seams in your clothes. The cry of a baby muffled in furs. The dread of knowing morning will bring more of the same, no matter how tightly you pray to the fire to last. Survival was not about valor. It was about gritted teeth and silent endurance. And when the rivers thawed and the expedition moved again, another struggle began, hauling impossible loads across mountains where even gravity seemed intent on ending them. Not the philosophical kind, but the kind that digs into your shoulders until the skin splits. Because when the rivers turned violent and the land rose into mountains, every object the core of Discovery carried became a punishment waiting to be lifted. You're not excused from this. A baby clings to your chest, and yet you are expected to keep pace as men grunt beneath canoes hoisted over their heads. Portaging was the polite term. In practice, it was human pack animal labour. Each canoe weighed hundreds of pounds, fashioned from cottonwood that seemed to drink water just to spite you. The men staggered, slipped, and cursed, but still carried, and behind them trailed bundles of gear, barrels of supplies, weapons, scientific instruments, all hauled inch by inch across terrain that was never meant for wheels or human backs. The journals describe it with admiration. They called it perseverance, endurance, courage, but the details reveal exhaustion so severe men collapse mid-march. The Missouri's Great Falls demanded a portage of nearly 18 miles, across ground riddled with prickly pear cactus. Boots shredded, feet bled, and spirits broke. Sacagawea did this while nursing, while recovering from illness, while navigating. No statue can capture the reality of that march. Consider how absurd the situation really was. Lewis and Clark insisted on carrying not just survival gear, but luxuries. They lugged along scientific instruments, maps, even a printing press. Yes, a printing press, across mountains. The same men who gagged down spoiled meat thought it wise to haul heavy machinery through rattlesnake country. History often edits this into determination. It was also folly. Sacagawea had no vote, only the burden of helping to make it possible. Physical labour became the true enemy. Rivers forced endless portages. Mountains demanded days of climbing while dragging horses and baggage. Mud swallowed boots. Winds knocked men to the ground. Insects returned with fury. And yet the expedition crawled forward, propelled by sheer stubbornness. Sacagawea's role was quieter, but no less essential. She gathered plants for food, pointed out trails, and carried her son. If men dropped their packs, they cursed and retrieved them. If she faltered, life itself faltered. The course journals marvel at the landscape, yet hidden within their words are endless accounts of exhaustion. Men describe their feet as lacerated to pieces by cactus and stone. They confess to fainting in the heat, to vomiting from overexertion. Their grand mission nearly ended on those portages, undone not by hostile tribes, but by the weight of their own cargo. And here lies another irony. For all their talk of discovery, The expedition followed trails already known to indigenous peoples. Sacagawea's Shoshone knowledge was not just helpful, it was indispensable. She understood mountain passes, knew where water could be found, and recognized signs in the land that the men could not read. Without her guidance, the cargo would have been abandoned, the expedition stranded in valleys without exit. Think of the absurdity. Great men of science, armed with compasses and chronometers, reduced to crawling forward at the pace set by a teenager with a baby on her back. Their discoveries depended not on their instruments, but on her endurance. And yet when monuments were later raised, her role was diminished to a side note. Close your eyes and feel the weight now. The baby pressing into your chest, the straps cutting into your shoulders, the smell of sweat rising from the men around you. Your feet bleed from cactus thorns, your hands blister from hauling ropes, and still you move forward because the expedition has no other option. Survival is momentum. Stop, and history stops with you. Now let's dive into what happened when illness struck, and survival hinged on improvised medicine that was often worse than the disease itself, because survival on the core of Discovery was not just about food or cold. It was about a constant parade of sicknesses that crept into camp and refused to leave. You felt this firsthand. In June of 1805 you nearly died. A violent illness struck, leaving you weak, gasping and unable to care for your child. The men panicked, not because they feared losing a comrade, but because they knew your knowledge was irreplaceable. Without you, their lifeline to Shoshone horses and mountain guidance would vanish. So they turned to medicine, or rather, what they called medicine. The expedition carried a supply of what was known as Rush's Thunderbolts, a potent laxative developed by Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers. Each pill contained massive doses of calomel, which was mercury chloride, and jalap root, a violent purgative. The logic was simple. Purge the body of its ills by flushing everything out, whether it needed to leave or not. The side effects were spectacular. Vomiting, sweating, diarrhea so explosive it marked campsites with trails that archaeologists still detect today. Imagine that. Modern science finds the past by locating mercury-laced feces from a century ago, and here is where humour collides with horror. These thunderbolts were administered liberally. Headache? Take a pill. Fever? Take a pill. Gunshot wound? Why not another pill? The result was often worse than the sickness itself, but at least the men felt they were doing something. For Sacagawea, already weakened by childbirth and exhaustion, it could have been a death sentence. Yet somehow she survived, pulling herself back from the brink and resuming her role as if nothing had happened. The medical chest also carried opium, which was used to dull pain and calm restless patients. Laudanum, a tincture of alcohol and opium, was poured down throats liberally. The men treated injuries, infections, and even toothaches with it. Pain faded, but so did clarity. In the fog of laudanum, decisions were made that shaped the expedition's fate. Sacagawea watched this unfold, likely receiving doses herself during her illness. Her survival was both miraculous and terrifying, balanced on chemicals barely understood. Beyond drugs, the men practiced bleeding. Yes, cutting veins to release bad humours. It was an old European tradition that persisted into the 19th century, even as evidence of its futility grew. For a malnourished, exhausted body, bloodletting was a shortcut to collapse. Yet it was considered treatment. Imagine being already faint from hunger, and then losing more blood to cure the problem. History calls it medicine. Modern ears call it lunacy. But perhaps the most absurd treatments were the improvisations. Snake bites were cauterized with hot irons. Frostbite was rubbed with snow. Wounds were washed in whiskey, then stitched crudely with needles meant for leather. Infections lingered, and some men carried scars for life. The medical journal of the expedition is filled with descriptions that read like experiments, a grim trial and error where human bodies were the laboratory. Sacagawea's presence added layers of resilience. Her Shoshone heritage carried knowledge of herbal remedies, poultices, and roots that eased pain or improved recovery. Camas root, bitter herbs, and willow bark were familiar medicines long before European science claimed them. Her contributions are less documented, but oral traditions suggest she applied this knowledge alongside the crude European methods. Between laudanum fog and herbal teas, survival found a fragile balance. Think about what this meant in practice. A fever in the wilderness could cripple the expedition. An infection from a small cut could end a life. Dysentery, scurvy, and parasites spread through the camp like invisible armies. Every night groans echoed in tents while Sacagawea tended both her child and her companions. History remembers the maps and discoveries. It rarely mentions the nights spent shivering with fever, the sweat-soaked blankets, the whispered prayers that the body would endure one more sunrise. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of sickness in camp. Sweat, blood and bile mingling with the smoke of damp fires. Men clutching their stomachs, staggering to the bushes, cursing the thunderbolts as they collapsed in exhaustion. And through it all, the steady figure of Sacagawea, surviving what killed many in her time, holding together both her family and the fragile hope of the expedition. Now wait until you discover how fragile survival became when diplomacy was the only cure, when entire lives depended not on herbs or pills, but on whether Sacagawea could turn words into peace before weapons were drawn. Here is where you, Sacagawea, became something more than a guide. You were the living proof that the Corps of Discovery was not an army of invaders. You carried an infant, and that infant was your shield. Tribes who might have bristled at a column of armed men saw you and saw family. No raiding party brought a mother with a newborn. You were the unspoken announcement of peace before any words left your mouth. The irony is that you were not even the direct translator most of the time. Your husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, spoke Hidatsa and some French. You spoke Shoshone and Hidatsa. The captains spoke only English. So diplomacy often unfolded like a child's game of telephone. Words passed from Shoshone to Hidatsa to French to English, then back again. Imagine the stakes of negotiating for horses or food while relying on a chain of 4 languages. One slip could turn a polite request into a death sentence, and yet it worked, largely because of you. In August 1805, the expedition reached the Shoshone. They needed horses desperately to cross the Rocky Mountains. Without them, the expedition would grind to a halt. When the captains met with the Shoshone chief, they leaned entirely on you. By some twist of fate, the chief was your brother Camiawait. The reunion transformed the negotiations from precarious to successful. Horses were secured, supplies gathered, and the journey could continue. A pause on that. The entire fate of the Corps of Discovery hinged on the coincidence that the woman they had drafted as translator turned out to be the sister of the leader they needed to persuade. History calls it providence. Reality calls it the most convenient family reunion in American exploration. Without you, they might have frozen in the Rockies, their journals buried beneath snow. Diplomacy extended beyond your own people. Along the way, the expedition encountered tribes including the Mandan, Hidatsa, Nez Perce, and others. Each meeting carried risk. European traders had already seeded distrust with violence and disease. One misstep could escalate into bloodshed. But you steadied the ground. A woman with a baby humanized the strangers, softening the image of armed men tramping into villages. Your presence said what their broken chain of translation could not. We're not here to raid. We're here to pass. The journals record these moments with admiration, though often from the perspective of the captains rather than yours. They describe the marvel of being greeted rather than attacked, the relief of horses acquired, the wonder of feasts shared. What they rarely note is that without your calm, your language, your very body, these negotiations would have ended in silence or violence. The absurdity is almost comic. Great men of science carrying sextants and chronometers were reduced to dependence on a teenager's family ties and vocabulary. They could chart the stars but not order a meal without you. Diplomacy also had hidden costs. Every word was a performance, every gesture weighed. You balanced cultures in tension, explaining European demands in ways that would not offend, translating indigenous traditions into terms the captains could grasp. It was exhausting, yet necessary. And all the while you carried a child who fussed and cried during councils, adding another layer of humanity that smoothed sharp edges. Close your eyes and picture the council fires, the crackle of flames, the smell of roasted meat, the circle of wary eyes fixed on you as words passed from tongue to tongue. The stakes were higher than maps or specimens. Survival was the only goal, and your voice was the bridge across worlds. And if you thought that was bad, wait until the expedition stumbled into territory where hunger collided with desperation, where the generosity of tribes turned into the only barrier between life and starvation, and survival meant accepting charity you could never repay. The Mandan and Hidatsa had already carried the expedition through its first brutal winter. Corn, beans, and squash filled bellies that would otherwise have collapsed. Later, the Shoshone provided horses and food. The Nez Perce saved the expedition outright when starvation seemed inevitable. The journals glow with admiration, but the subtext is stark. Without constant aid, the Corps would have been reduced to scavenging carrion. The supposed triumph of American exploration rested on borrowed meals. Food was not just charity, it was diplomacy, ritual, and obligation. When tribes offered dried salmon, camas root, or dog meat, refusal was insult. Acceptance meant trust. The captains scribbled about strange flavors, but in truth they were swallowing alliances. You, Sacagawea, bridged the gap, explaining why certain meals mattered, why participation was survival not only of the body but of peace itself. One of the strangest meals came with the Nez Perce. Starving men were given salmon and camas root, which they devoured without restraint. The result was nearly catastrophic. The sudden flood of food into starved intestines triggered violent illness. For days the Corps staggered through cramps and sickness, yet still, without that aid, they would have died. This was the delicate balance of frontier hospitality. Grateful dependence followed by bodily rebellion. Consider the irony. These men were hailed as explorers, yet they could not feed themselves reliably. Their diet relied on strangers' generosity, strangers who saw through Sacagawea that these outsiders were vulnerable, not invincible. They were armed, but also pitiful, strong enough to chart rivers, weak enough to faint without a loaf of bread. Your own knowledge filled gaps too. You identified edible roots, berries, and herbs, passing them to hungry hands. Camas bulbs roasted carefully, wild berries sweet enough to soften hunger pangs, bitter herbs to ease digestion. These were small offerings, yet without them men might have poisoned themselves or wasted away. The journals mention these moments in passing, but each plant meant survival one more day. The generosity of tribes went beyond food. Lodging was offered, guides provided, canoes shared. Each gift carried weight. The Corps pretended to be leaders, yet they followed paths carved long before them. They recorded details as discoveries, yet the reality was dependence disguised as exploration. Sacagawea knew this truth intimately. She'd grown up within the rhythms of these lands. The captains marvelled at salmon runs. You saw survival passed from one season to the next. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. Hungry men crouched by a fire tearing into dried fish with trembling hands. Camas root roasting in the embers, filling the air with a smell somewhere between onions and garlic. Children of the village watching with curiosity as supposed conquerors reduced themselves to beggars. You, Sacagawea, balancing pride and necessity, translating gratitude and making sure no offence was given, because one wrong gesture could turn a feast into a fight. And that is the absurd brilliance of history. Great expeditions survive not on maps or courage, but on the willingness of strangers to share dinner. Without corn, salmon, or roots, there would be no journals, no maps, no monuments. There would only be graves. What saved them was not their strength or foresight. It was you. While water roared and panic spread, you calmly gathered floating supplies, salvaging irreplaceable items from the current. The journals record this with understatement, noting that without your intervention, much of their knowledge would have been lost. But think about that. The survival of maps, specimens, and records, the very backbone of American expansion, rested on a teenage mother calmly plucking bundles from a flooded river. Rivers were constant hazards. Boats were too heavy, too unwieldy, and often poorly made. Cottonwood warped when soaked, seams leaked, and paddles splintered. Rapids along the Missouri and later the Columbia turned transport into gambling. One wrong stroke and everything tipped. Supplies were lashed down, but the current tore through bindings. More than once, entire stores of powder, clothing, and food were soaked beyond repair. The irony is that water, which carried them forward, also betrayed them. Drinking water bred disease. River crossings froze limbs. Rapids threatened lives. Yet they had no alternative. Horses could only travel so far. Wagons were impossible, so they trusted their fate to fragile crafts while pretending they were in control. The Columbia River tested them most of all. Jagged cliffs, raging rapids, and unpredictable currents turned every mile into a gauntlet. The Nez Perce offered dugout canoes carved from massive trees, sleek and elegant compared to the clumsy craft of the Corps. The men marvelled at their design, yet still mishandled them. Flipping and swamping in rapids, locals navigated with ease. It was a reminder that knowledge of the land always outweighed imported ambition. Close your eyes and hear it. The crash of water against rocks, the splinter of wood, the desperate cries of men clinging to overturned boats. You, Sacagawea, holding your child tight, feeling the spray sting your face while wondering if the river will take everything. This was not adventure. This was survival dressed in wet leather and blind luck. Accidents did not end with capsizes. At times, boats drifted into each other, splintering frames and snapping oars. Powder kegs soaked through, leaving weapons useless. Scientific instruments, once treated like sacred relics, ended up cracked and useless at the bottom of a canoe. And every time disaster struck, it was you who steadied the panic, salvaged what could be saved, and reminded the men that discovery without survival meant nothing. The absurdity is clear. The Corps of Discovery, tasked with charting a continent, could not even trust themselves not to flip over in a current. Their maps recorded mountains and rivers, yet they could barely survive the rivers they drew. Without your intervention, their achievements would be smudges on soggy paper drifting downstream. And if you thought the rivers were merciless, the mountains laughed even louder. Because when the Corps of Discovery turned westward, they walked directly into the Rockies, a wall of stone and snow that cared nothing for ambition or maps. You knew these mountains from childhood stories. They were not landmarks to admire, but living barriers. To cross them meant hunger, frost, and risk that could break the strongest body. The men carried their instruments and rifles, but in the face of cliffs and passes, they became little more than weary climbers stumbling after you. In September of 1805, the expedition entered the Bitterroot Mountains, part of the Rockies that even seasoned travellers dreaded. It was one of the most gruelling stretches of the entire journey. For 11 days they climbed and descended ridges, often without food, often without clear trails. The journals described snow falling in September, trails so narrow horses slipped to their deaths, and men collapsing from exhaustion. Food disappeared almost immediately. Game was scarce, roots were buried deep, and snow masked forage. The Corps resorted to slaughtering horses, animals they depended on for carrying supplies, reduced now to desperate meals. They boiled hides into broth, gnawed marrow from bones, and chewed whatever scraps of meat they could find. One entry notes that they ate candles again, the last reserve of fat. Hunger was not an inconvenience. It was a shadow clinging to every step. You endured this with a baby strapped to you, a child who required constant nourishment your body barely had the strength to provide. Malnutrition was not abstract. It was your milk drying, your body weakening, your mind forced to keep walking anyway. That is the reality hidden beneath the tidy lines of journals. Snow was the second enemy. The bitterroots buried trails in white silence, hiding dangers beneath every step. Horses slipped, men fell, supplies scattered down slopes. Nights were worse. The cold pierced thin shelters, turning sweat from the climb into ice that stiffened clothing. Frostbite lurked, and exhaustion made fires harder to keep alive. Every spark became precious, every ember guarded as if it were gold. The absurd part is how unprepared they remained. The Corps believed they could haul themselves through by sheer determination. They underestimated the Rockies entirely. Without the help of the Shoshone and later the Nez Perce, who guided them through passes and shared what little food could be spared, they would have perished. The Corps of Discovery might have ended as a frozen collection of bones scattered along ridges, their discoveries erased by snow. Close your eyes and imagine the march. The crunch of snow beneath boots worn thin, the wheeze of horses struggling with every climb, the silence of men too tired to curse. You, Sacagawea, feeling your child stir against you, wondering if your own body will collapse before the mountains relent. And still, 1 foot forward. Because stopping meant death, and survival meant momentum no matter how small. History frames this passage as triumph. The truth is closer to collapse. Men describe the bitterroots as the most terrifying part of the journey, worse than any battle or storm. When they finally stumbled out of the mountains, half-starved and gaunt, they were greeted with food from the Nez Perce. Salmon, roots and shelter pulled them back from the edge. Without that aid, the expedition would have ended then and there. And yet the journals still glowed with discovery. They described landscapes and rivers with admiration even as their bodies failed. That is the contradiction of exploration. Beauty and misery walking side by side, with survival balanced on the kindness of those who'd been navigating those mountains for centuries. Sacagawea understood this. The captains recorded it, but never truly grasped the scale of their dependence. Once the Corps reached the western rivers, the threat no longer came from hunger or snow, but from the new and unsettling world of the Pacific coast, where the ocean itself seemed to mock their survival. The mountains finally gave way to rivers that rushed westward, and beyond them lay the ocean the Corps had dreamed of since setting out. But the sight of the Pacific was not triumph, it was punishment. Salt spray stung the skin, endless rain-soaked clothing, and winds tore through camps as if mocking the exhausted explorers who had clawed their way across a continent. You had carried your child through swarms of insects, over mountains and across rivers, only to arrive at a shore where survival remained just as precarious. The winter of 1805 to 1806 at Fort Clatsop was one of the expedition's most miserable seasons. Rain fell nearly every day for months, soaking hides, rotting clothing, and turning shelters into damp caves of mildew and smoke. The journals recorded only a handful of dry days between November and March. Food was again the tyrant. Salmon was abundant, but by winter even the fish seemed tired of the expedition, their flesh soft, their taste unpleasant after months of constant meals. Elk meat became the staple, but herds thinned under relentless hunting, and the Corps complained of fatigue and hunger once again. The men described themselves as gaunt, their clothes in tatters, their patience gone. What was supposed to be a triumphant coastal moment became a wet, shivering endurance test. The irony was that they had reached their destination, yet felt no glory. Instead of planting flags and celebrating conquest, they argued over where to build shelter, how to divide labour, and which rotting carcass could still be salvaged for dinner. Salt was essential to preserve meat, but making it meant boiling seawater for days, feeding endless fires while the rain tried to smother every flame. It was an exhausting cycle of labour for only small piles of salt that vanished quickly. Sacagawea carried her role into this misery with the same endurance as before. She foraged for berries and roots even in the damp coastal forests, keeping the men alive when the hunt failed. Her presence also steadied encounters with the Clatsop and Chinook people. who traded goods and food but demanded fair exchange. The captains recorded their admiration of local canoes and clothing, yet negotiations were often tense. You softened those edges, reminding everyone that even at the edge of the continent, survival depended on fragile human connections. The dampness carried consequences beyond comfort. Clothes rotted from constant exposure, shoes disintegrated, and lice spread through camp. Fevers and coughs filled the nights. The journals complained of endless fleas, scratching the interrupted sleep, bodies that could never feel clean or dry. Exploration became less about discovery and more about enduring the small humiliations of moisture, insects, and hunger in a land that refused to welcome them. Close your eyes and picture it. A smoky hut filled with damp hides, men curled in the corners scratching at lice, the smell of wet dog clinging to every surface. Rain drums constantly against the roof, a reminder that even the sky will not grant relief. You rock your child to sleep in this environment, wondering if he will grow strong or if his first memories will be of endless cold and wet. Yet through this suffering, knowledge was recorded. Plants, animals, tides, and trade all found their way into the journals. The irony of the Pacific winter is that its misery produced some of the richest scientific records of the expedition. Human suffering turned into neat lines of data about rainfall, species, and geography. The cost of discovery was measured in coughs, fevers, and endless damp blankets. When the Corps finally prepared to return eastward, they were thinner, weaker, and weary of the ocean they had longed to see. Sacagawea's child was stronger now, having survived against the odds. Your presence had again meant the difference between despair and progress, though history rarely lingers on the details of what that cost you. The coast marked not the end, but the turning point. The expedition still had to retrace its steps, still had to survive rivers, mountains, hunger and fatigue. The journey back east would not be easier, only longer, dragging weary bodies back across the same unforgiving continent with nothing guaranteed but hardship. Leaving the Pacific coast was less a celebration than an act of resignation. The men were exhausted, their clothes little more than rags, and their supplies diminished. They had made it to the ocean only to discover that the hardest part was still ahead. Every mile home would retrace the same dangers that had already stripped them to the bone. You, Sacagawea, carried your son as before, your endurance becoming the expedition's unacknowledged backbone. The captains noted your calm in their journals, though the lines are sparse compared to the reality. While they debated routes and measurements, you focused on survival, foraging what you could, and translating when diplomacy was required. The Corps marched eastward, but the hardships did not lessen simply because they were heading home. The return carried its own absurdities. The party split into groups at times to cover more ground, a risky strategy that exposed them to greater danger. This meant fewer hands to carry supplies, fewer voices to share the work of paddling and portaging. Disputes emerged more frequently. Hunger and fatigue sharpened tempers, and what once seemed like a unified mission became a collection of weary men barely held together by routine. The journals record constant complaints about food, clothing, and fatigue. Powder was spoiled from damp storage, rifles misfired, and hunting parties returned empty-handed more often than not. The men resorted again to eating dogs when offered by tribes along the way. Some entries admit with surprising frankness that dog meat, though initially repulsive to them, became a preferred meal for its fat and nourishment. It is a reminder of how hunger rewrites the rules of culture. Sacagawea's role in the second half of the expedition was just as crucial. You advised on routes, recognized landmarks, and identified edible plants. At one point, your knowledge of the terrain allowed the Corps to avoid becoming hopelessly lost, cutting days off their march. Yet the official records reduced these contributions to passing mentions, as if history could only hold so much space for your presence. Illness struck again, as it always did when exhaustion piled high. Fever spread through the camp. Men coughed through nights, their lungs weakened by months of damp air and malnutrition. Once more the crude medicines appeared, laudanum to dull pain, calomel to purge bowels. The mercury in those pills left traces still detectable in the soil along the route today, a literal chemical signature of suffering. Tensions with local tribes also became sharper. Initial curiosity had given way to wariness. The Corps had nothing left to trade but promises, and even those were stretched thin. Diplomatic success was not guaranteed, and more than once the presence of you and your child softened what might have turned violent. The sight of a woman carrying an infant still served as the most effective shield the expedition possessed. Close your eyes and imagine the return march. Weary boots slapping mud, clothes stiff with salt and sweat, men silent from exhaustion. The air smelled of damp leather and smoke from small fires barely kept alive. You walked with your child against your chest, your breath fogging in the chill, your mind fixed only on the thought of the next meal, the next mile, the next fire. Exploration had lost its glamour. What remained was the grind of endurance. By the time the expedition reached the Mandan villages again, they were gaunt and broken, yet alive. Their journals were filled with data, their maps with detail, but their bodies carried the scars of starvation, illness, and exhaustion. The Corps had crossed the continent and back, but only by leaning constantly on the land, on the people they encountered, and on your quiet resilience. The return did not mean relief. It meant reintegration into a world that would celebrate the captains while reducing your presence to a footnote, even though without you the journey might have ended long before the Pacific was ever reached. The march eastward was still brutal, but what never faltered was the compulsion to write, sketch, and collect. The Corps of Discovery was not just an expedition of survival, it was also a travelling laboratory, a museum on the move, a caravan that refused to stop cataloguing the continent, even while its members were half-starved and sick. Every day the captains recorded notes about new species of plants and animals. Nearly 200 plants unknown to European science were described. Dozens of animals were sketched and detailed, from the grizzly bear to the prairie dog. It was science conducted with frostbitten fingers and aching bellies, a reminder that exploration was not only about crossing land, but about labelling it. You, Sacagawea, became a silent partner in this work. While the men marvelled at the taste of roots and the sight of strange flowers, you already knew many of them. The camas bulb that nearly poisoned the expedition if cooked improperly, the wild berries that could be eaten safely, the bitter herbs that eased digestion. What they treated as discovery was, for you, memory. Generations of Shoshone knowledge flowed through your hands as you prepared these plants. They were scribbling science, you were applying survival. One striking example came with the prairie dog. The Corps was so fascinated by the animal that they attempted to send a live one back to President Jefferson. They flooded a burrow with gallons of water, captured the squealing creature, and then tried to keep it alive in a cage across hundreds of miles. Their notes describe its diet, behaviour, and noises. To you it was simply another animal of the plains, a nuisance to step around, hardly worth the fuss. Yet to European science it was novelty, a curiosity worth drowning out of its home. Animals both awed and threatened the Corps. Grizzly bears in particular became infamous. The men expected them to fall quickly to musket fire, but discovered the opposite. Journal entries describe bears absorbing multiple bullets before charging, sending armed men fleeing in terror. One noted grimly that hunting the bear was less sport and more gamble, with lives wagered against claws. For you, the reality was even sharper. A charging bear was not scientific data. It was the possibility of death while carrying a child through open country. Birds, insects, fish, and mammals filled the journals. Elk and bison were described in meticulous detail, their habits and numbers recorded for posterity. Salmon runs astonished the men, filling rivers so thick that nets groaned under the weight. Yet the marvel of abundance clashed constantly with hunger. Food spoiled, animals migrated, and the captain's neat lists could not fill empty stomachs. Documentation did not stop starvation. It only distracted from it. The scientific drive extended to geography. Mountains were measured with barometers, rivers charted with compasses, stars recorded at night through sextants. The Corps produced maps of astonishing accuracy given their conditions, yet every line was drawn through exhaustion. Imagine holding a sextant with trembling hands while your stomach knotted in hunger. Imagine sketching the outline of a new flower while your boots leaked snow melt onto your feet. Discovery was carried on backs already breaking. Sacagawea's contributions to geography went beyond memory. She recognized passes and routes, correcting assumptions and pointing out paths invisible to men trained only in instruments. Her presence meant that many lines on those maps were drawn accurately, because she guided the expedition to where they needed to be. Her knowledge was lived, not calculated, but it shaped the data all the same. The absurdity becomes clear when you read the journals. One page may gush about the beauty of a flowering plant, the next may describe a man doubled over with dysentery. A paragraph notes the elegance of salmon leaping upriver, followed immediately by complaints of hunger and exhaustion. The journals became a blend of science and suffering, knowledge and misery inked side by side. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. A damp fire sputtering under rain. Men hunched around, one scribbling notes about a new bird, another skinning an animal for preservation, while the rest gnaw on scraps of half-cooked meat. You, Sacagawea, holding your child, foraging for roots, translating when needed, watching as exhaustion wrapped itself around every task. Science did not pause for survival. Survival simply became another part of science. The compulsion to document everything was Jefferson's dream fulfilled. He had ordered Lewis and Clark to record not just the path west, but everything along it. Plants, animals, tribes, languages, geology. Nothing was too small. That obsession turned misery into information, misery into knowledge. The expedition returned not just with stories, but with thousands of notes, sketches, and specimens that filled rooms in Washington. Yet the truth behind those specimens was far less noble. Every pressed plant was gathered with fingers bleeding from thorns. Every animal pelt was carried by men staggering with fatigue. Every star chart was drawn by firelight while coughing from smoke. For Sacagawea, the irony must have been sharp. What they considered science was the fabric of her daily life. The plants that fed, the animals that threatened, the routes that guided. These were not discoveries, they were inheritance. Yet her knowledge became subsumed into their records. Her role diminished even as it enabled the very discoveries they celebrated. The legacy of this scientific labour still shapes American history. The maps informed settlement, the notes enriched natural science, the sketches became reference for generations. But beneath the tidy lines of atlases and the Latin names of species lies the truth of how they were gathered, through relentless misery, unbroken hunger, and the quiet endurance of a woman carrying a child across the same landscape she helped them describe. Every record came at a cost, and the greatest cost was borne by the people whose knowledge had already existed long before Jefferson ever imagined discovery. The Corps of Discovery returned east with volumes of information, but they left unrecorded the exhaustion, the cultural theft and the silent debt owed to those who had carried them through. The cataloguing of animals might have looked neat in the journals, but in reality the continent's wildlife was less a collection of specimens and more a gauntlet of hazards. Every mile carried something ready to bite, sting, claw or poison, as if the land itself had organised an army of creatures to test the core. Grizzly bears were the most dramatic. The captains wrote in awe about their size, describing animals that stood taller than any man and weighed hundreds of pounds. At first, the men assumed a few musket shots would bring the beast down. Instead, they learned the hard way that grizzlies could shrug off multiple bullets, charge at terrifying speed, and refuse to die quickly. Several encounters ended with men sprinting for trees, dropping weapons in panic, and admitting in journals that the bear was more terrible than any enemy. You carried your child through these territories knowing that a single misstep could trigger disaster. A bear did not care about science, diplomacy, or maps. It cared only about hunger or defense. To march through grisly country was to live with a constant dread of claws larger than your hands. Yet bears were not the only menace. Wolves followed the expedition at night, their howls echoing through camps. Though they rarely attacked directly, their presence frayed nerves and reminded the men that they were never alone. Cougars stalked silently, their eyes glinting in the firelight, unseen but felt. Smaller predators like wolverines raided supplies, shredding hides and stealing food with reckless ferocity. Each creature became another line in the journals, but for those living it, each encounter was terror edged with exhaustion. Snakes slithered through the grass, rattlesnakes in particular providing constant alarm. One wrong step and venom could end a life before medicine had any chance to intervene. The men killed dozens, recording the length of fangs and the rattle segments with fascination. But the real story was the fear that accompanied every step into tall grass. You had to walk carefully with your son bound against you, always watching the ground, always aware that discovery could be a strike waiting to happen. Insects added another layer of torment. Mosquitoes never relented, but they were joined by gnats, fleas, lice, and biting flies. The journals describe nights where men wrapped themselves in blankets despite the heat, simply to escape the swarms. Fleas infested campsites, driving men to scratch themselves raw, their skin bleeding while they tried to sleep. You endured this too, your child crying as insects swarmed around him, your own body covered in bites that never healed before new ones appeared. The absurdity of it all was that the captain still treated these creatures as scientific curiosities. They measured wingspans, sketched body parts, and noted habits, while the rest of the camp groaned under the reality of itching welts and gnawed supplies. A grizzly bear was written as Ursus horribilis. To the core, it was a specimen. To you, it was a nightmare capable of tearing apart the fragile survival you carried with you every step. Game animals sometimes brought both blessing and curse. Bison herds stretched across the plains in staggering numbers, feeding the expedition when luck favoured the hunt. But abundance also brought risk. Stampedes threatened to crush camps, and overconfidence sometimes left men far from safety, dragging carcasses through heat while wolves circled. Elk, deer, and antelope provided food, but processing their hides and meat consumed endless labour. Every kill was a victory followed by hours of exhausting work. Smaller creatures added to the litany of trials. Porcupines chewed on wooden tools and canoe paddles, attracted to the salt from sweaty hands. Prairie dogs dug holes that broke horses' legs. Skunks raided supplies with pungent results. Each animal seemed intent on reminding the expedition that survival meant constant vigilance. Close your eyes and imagine camp at night. The fire crackling low, wolves howling in the distance, mosquitoes whining in your ears, the rustle of something large moving just beyond the circle of light. Your child stirs uneasily against you. The men clutch their rifles, too tired to keep watch, yet too afraid to sleep soundly. This was not exploration in comfort. It was a nightly negotiation with a continent alive and waiting to test every weakness. Through it all, Sacagawea's calm mattered. You had grown up in a world where animals were part of survival, not separate from it. Your knowledge of which tracks to avoid, which berries would distract bears, which herbs soothed insect bites, gave the core an advantage they rarely recognized. You turned terror into tolerable endurance, though history would later frame the story as if survival was earned by bravery alone. The truth is clearer. Discovery was less about science and more about learning not to be eaten, poisoned, or bitten long enough to finish a map. Every journal entry about a new species was written against the backdrop of teeth, claws, and stings that could end everything before the ink dried. The march eastward continued, and while the continent's animals tested the expedition's limits, the greatest dangers often came not from the wild, but from within the ranks themselves, where tempers and authority clashed as exhaustion wore away discipline. The continent had teeth, but so did the men themselves. After months of hunger, sickness, and exhaustion, tempers frayed. The Corps of Discovery had been handpicked for strength, endurance, and loyalty. Yet no amount of selection could prevent the inevitable unravelling when men lived together under constant duress. You observed this unravelling from the quiet position of someone whose survival left no room for ego. While men bickered, you carried your child, gathered food, and steadied negotiations. But the cracks were there, spreading through the Corps like the frost-splitting wood. From the beginning, discipline had been strict. Courts-martial were held for desertion, theft, or disobedience. Punishments included lashes, hard labour, and humiliation. One soldier was sentenced to death for mutiny in the early days, though later pardoned. The journals record these events with a stern tone, as if authority could stitch together the fabric of obedience. But by the time the Corps reached the far side of the continent, rules bent under the weight of misery. Arguments broke out over routes, over rations, over how much labour each man contributed. Charbonneau, your husband, was notorious for clumsy mistakes, once nearly capsizing a boat full of supplies. His panic in emergencies irritated the captains and enraged the men who cleaned up his errors. Complaints about his cooking, his temper, and his reliability peppered the journals. You often bore the consequences steadying chaos he left in his wake. The captains themselves were not immune to conflict. Lewis and Clark were close partners, but even they disagreed on strategy. Journals hint at frustrations simmering beneath their outward unity. Clark sometimes doubted Lewis's decisions. Lewis sometimes found Clark's pace too slow. Both shared the pressure of command, knowing that their failure would reverberate across the nation. Their differences never exploded into open division, but the tension seeped into the ranks. Exhaustion amplified every irritation. Men argued over hunting spoils, jealous when one group returned with food while another came back empty-handed. They quarrelled about sleeping space, about who carried the heaviest loads, about who shirked chores. These were not noble explorers debating philosophy. These were starving, flea-bitten men snapping at one another over scraps. The absurdity lay in how quickly fatigue eroded discipline. Soldiers trained to march in step and obey orders found themselves too tired to follow simple instructions. Journals mentioned delays caused by men oversleeping, collapsing mid-portage, or wandering off on side hunts. Exploration slowed not because of rivers or mountains, but because of human frailty dressed in ragged uniforms. Even illness became a source of conflict. Men who faltered slowed the group, and resentment simmered against those too sick to pull their weight. At times, the line between compassion and contempt blurred. The Corps could not afford weakness, yet weakness was inevitable. Every man eventually succumbed to fever, cramps, or wounds. Each recovery required others to labour harder. You were rarely recorded in these disputes, yet your presence softened them in subtle ways. A woman and a child in the midst of quarrelling soldiers reminded the Corps of what they were meant to protect, what they claimed to represent. The sight of you gathering roots or calming your child added a layer of humility to arguments that might have spiralled further. While men clashed, you endured, and endurance often proved the stronger example. Still, resentment built as months dragged on. The journey eastward was no easier than the march west, and discipline weakened further. Some men took liberties with hunting, consuming food before it was shared. Others resisted orders to march through fatigue. Charbonneau's blunders continued, one nearly ending in disaster when his horse bolted during a hunt, scattering supplies. Journals note the captain's frustration, though they held the Corps together by sheer force of will. Close your eyes and picture the camp. Smoke rising from a weak fire, men muttering in low voices, one cursing another for taking more than his share of meat. The captains writing by dim light, their words steady while their patience thinned. You, Sacagawea, holding your child in silence, watching the strain of men who had crossed a continent but could not always cross the distance between themselves. History remembers the Corps of Discovery as a unified force, but the reality was a fragile coalition of individuals pressed to their limits. Conflicts simmered constantly, sometimes erupting, sometimes swallowed in silence, but always present. The miracle was not that they succeeded without fracture, but that their fractures did not consume them entirely. As the expedition pressed onward, the strain of men against men remained, but new challenges rose to overshadow quarrels. Survival demanded attention, and survival often came not from discipline or discovery, but from chance encounters that tipped the balance one way or another. Crossing a continent was not only a battle against rivers, mountains, and hunger, it was also a battle against the sheer clumsiness of human beings, forced into conditions that magnified every mistake. The Corps of Discovery was a parade of accidents waiting to happen. Supplies caught fire, rifles misfired, men slipped, boats capsized, and injuries piled up in ways that had nothing to do with hostile terrain and everything to do with bad luck and human error. You saw this chaos unfold day after day. Some dangers came from nature, but just as many came from the very people who were supposed to endure it. Fires were among the most constant hazards. The expedition lived by flame, and with damp wood and flimsy shelters, accidents were inevitable. Sparks leapt onto hides, blankets, and supplies. At one point, tents caught fire, destroying food stores that could not be replaced. Powder kegs stored too close to flames threatened explosions that would have erased the entire Corps in a single instant. Lewis's journal notes several close calls where flames raced through camp faster than men could react. Each night, the glow of fire meant survival, but it also meant risk. For Sacagawea, carrying a child into smoke-filled shelters was not triumph. It was endurance at the edge of disaster. The absurdity reached its peak when fires were started unintentionally by men too exhausted to control their tools. Charbonneau, your husband, once nearly tipped a pan of boiling water onto supplies in a panic, and his blunders became infamous within the Corps. Journals describe him as clumsy and unreliable, yet his presence was tolerated because you were indispensable. His mistakes burned more than fires. They burned patience. Accidents with weapons were equally dangerous. Muskets were the lifeline of the Corps, but damp powder and rough handling made them treacherous. Misfires were common, and injuries from poorly handled rifles filled the record. One soldier shot himself in the foot, another grazed a companion while cleaning his weapon. The captains treated these moments as unfortunate but inevitable. To you, watching men fumble with weapons around your infant son, it was a reminder that danger often came not from predators or enemies, but from within the circle of camp. Hunting accidents piled misery onto already fragile bodies. Men chased bison too recklessly, only to be thrown from horses and left bruised or broken. Elk hunts turned into disasters when rifles jammed, leaving men exposed to charging animals. One near tragedy unfolded when a wounded elk lashed out, nearly trampling hunters before being brought down. These events filled the journals not with pride, but with exhausted acknowledgement that survival was a game of dice rolled against nature. Falls added to the catalogue of accidents. Portages over slippery rocks left men tumbling into rivers, their bodies bruised and their supplies soaked. Horses slipped on narrow trails, sending packs tumbling down ravines. Canoes overturned when men misjudged currents, scattering goods that could never be replaced. You witnessed each of these with the quiet certainty that human error was as relentless as the land itself. Illness could be traced back to carelessness as well. Food spoiled when left exposed, spreading sickness through the Corps. Men drank stagnant water without boiling it, ignoring the lessons learned earlier, and suffered days of cramps and fever. Fleas and lice spread because clothing was rarely cleaned, and the men complained constantly of itching that never ceased. The captains noted these complaints with some irritation, as if discipline could conquer vermin. But lice were not impressed by orders, and fleas obeyed no command. One accident nearly cost you your life. In May 1805, While sailing near the Missouri River, a squall threatened to capsize a boat carrying vital supplies. Charbonneau panicked at the rudder, nearly flipping the craft entirely. It was you, Sacagawea, who calmly gathered maps, instruments and medicine as they floated away, saving them from being lost forever. The captains recorded their gratitude, but the truth is starker. Without your intervention, years of planning and survival would have been erased by one man's mistake. The irony of all these accidents is that they were avoidable. Yet in the misery of hunger, exhaustion and endless labour, men became careless. The expedition's journals read like a litany of blunders barely corrected before they became fatal. Discovery was less about grand achievement and more about enduring a chain of near catastrophes strung together over years. Close your eyes and imagine camp again. A spark leaps from the fire onto damp hides. Men scramble to smother it before flames spread. A musket misfires nearby, the crack echoing too close to your child's ear. A canoe overturns in the current. Men screaming as supplies vanish beneath the surface. These were the ordinary rhythms of the Corps. Heroism was not in the grand strokes of maps, but in surviving the constant fumbling of tired hands and bad luck. Accident shaped the Corps as much as discovery. They slowed progress, forced improvisation, and reminded everyone how fragile survival truly was. Yet they also revealed the resilience of those who endured them. For you, Sacagawea, every accident was another test of calm. You salvaged, steadied, and endured, proving that quiet resilience outweighed panic every time. The Corps of Discovery eventually returned home alive, but the path they left behind was littered not only with data and maps, but with scars, broken supplies, and the memory of mistakes that nearly erased them from history. The miracle of their journey is not that they discovered the Pacific. The miracle is that they survived their own clumsiness long enough to tell the tale. As the marches continued, the accidents never ceased, but new challenges emerged. Challenges not of fire or falls, but of politics, where the Corps found themselves entangled in the shifting alliances and tensions of tribes whose patience had worn thin. Moving east again meant revisiting territories that were no longer unfamiliar. The Corps of Discovery had once entered villages as strangers, but now they returned as burdens. The generosity that had saved them before could not be assumed again. Food stores were scarce, tempers were thinner, and promises made on the march westward were coming due. You stood in the middle of this fragile politics. A teenage mother carrying a child was still the most effective symbol of peace the Corps possessed. Your presence softened suspicion, but goodwill was not endless. Each encounter with tribes on the return journey was a test of diplomacy, a reminder that survival depended less on maps or muskets than on whether hungry men could convince equally hungry communities to share resources. The captains carried medals, flags, and Jefferson's grand speeches about friendship and trade. They repeated them as if words alone could bind nations. But the reality was harsher. Tribes already bore the scars of European disease, encroaching trade networks, and violent clashes with settlers. To them, the Corps was not discovery. It was intrusion. Generosity was given, but it was measured. At the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, where the Corps had survived their first winter, relationships remained cordial but strained. Supplies were exchanged, but not with the abundance once offered. Food had to be earned, often through trade that seemed lopsided in the eyes of the captains. What Jefferson saw as diplomacy was, in truth, negotiation under duress. The Corps could not afford offence, so every word, every gesture mattered. The Teton Lakota had been more confrontational on the westward journey and tensions remained. The Corps knew that armed conflict would end them, so they approached with caution, offering gifts and emphasizing peace. Your presence again tilted the balance, reminding leaders that this was not an invading army, but a ragged group staggering toward home. Still, mistrust lingered. Every alliance was temporary, every smile edged with calculation. One of the most critical encounters came again with the Nez Perce. These people had saved the Corps after their near collapse in the Bitterroot Mountains, feeding starving men and helping them build canoes. On the return trip, gratitude was heavy, but expectations were higher. The Corps owed their lives to the Nez purse, yet they had little to offer in repayment beyond words and trinkets. Diplomacy here was not about promises of future trade. It was about survival today. You, Sacagawea, translated, explained and softened the gaps between cultures. Without that bridge, the Corps might have been left to starve in the very lands where they had once been rescued. The journals often describe these exchanges in glowing terms, as if friendships had been sealed. But beneath the neat handwriting lay unease. The Corps were foreigners passing through lands already webbed with politics, rivalries and histories they barely understood. Every meeting risked misstep. Every negotiation could unravel into violence. That it did not speaks less to Jefferson's medals, and more to the diplomacy of you and the people willing to extend patience one more time. Tensions also surfaced within the Corps as diplomacy dragged on. Men grew restless during negotiations, hungry for food that was often withheld until agreements were reached. Miscommunication stretched councils into endless hours. The captains demanded discipline, but exhaustion eroded patience. Soldiers muttered about wasted time, about being made to wait while their bellies ached. You had seen this cycle before. Hunger always sharpened tempers, and politics always demanded calm. You provided the calm, not through orders, but through presence. Humour hides in the contradictions. The Corps carried Jefferson's instructions about civilizing and teaching tribes, yet they were the ones constantly begging for food, guidance and shelter. The image of superior explorers collapsed into reality. A line of gaunt men clutching empty bellies, asking strangers for one more chance to survive. Discovery in practice was dependence painted as destiny. Close your eyes and picture the council fires again. Chiefs seated in quiet authority, captains offering gifts of beads and cloth, the air thick with smoke and tension. You sit with your son in your arms, your voice passing words from one language to another, turning threats into negotiations, turning silence into survival. Without those words, rifles might have spoken instead. The fragile politics of the frontier shaped the Corps as much as rivers or mountains. Alliances carried them forward, mistrust slowed them, and your presence steadied the balance each time. The expedition survived not because of Jefferson's vision or the captain's authority, but because patience was extended again and again by people who had little reason to give it. Survival through diplomacy carried its own exhaustion, but the return journey still demanded more. Politics may have smoothed encounters, yet the grind of marching, the endless labour of hauling supplies, and the physical collapse of bodies still dictated the pace. Discovery was not finished. Hardship had not relented. The continent had more lessons to teach, and the Corps was not yet done paying its price. The eastward march was supposed to feel lighter. The Corps of Discovery had reached the Pacific, mapped the rivers, crossed the mountains and survived winters that should have killed them. But the return was no triumphant parade. It was the same exhaustion dragged in reverse, the same rivers and passes, only this time with less wonder and more weariness. You carried your child as before, your steps steady while the men around you stumbled. The journals note progress, but between the lines is the fatigue of bodies pushed past breaking. The Corps was thinner, their clothes torn to rags, their rifles rusted from constant damp. They had marched thousands of miles already, and now they faced thousands more, with nothing to drive them but the promise of home. Illness clung to the expedition. Dysentery spread again, fevers rose and fell, and parasites continued their quiet feast. Fleas and lice never relented, scratching away sleep, bleeding skin raw. The journals complain of itching, of fatigue, of bellies that could not be satisfied. Food remained uneven. Some days hunting was abundant, filling campfires with fresh elk and deer. Other days bellies shrank against ribs while men chewed candle ends again. The land gave and withheld in equal measure, and survival depended on which mood it carried. The return also brought fractures. The Corps split into smaller groups to cover more ground and explore tributaries. a decision that risked lives for the sake of more maps. Lewis led one group, Clark another, with men divided between them. Smaller numbers meant greater vulnerability. If illness struck, fewer hands could carry the load. If accidents happened, fewer voices could call for aid. Yet the captains demanded more discovery, squeezing the last drops of data from an expedition already stretched to the edge. Encounters with tribes remained fragile. Some welcomed them back with food and shelter. Others regarded them with suspicion. The novelty of strangers had worn thin, and the Corps carried little to trade. Promises of future prosperity rang hollow when bellies were empty. You stood again as a living symbol of peace, your child steady in your arms, softening counsels that might otherwise have hardened into violence. The absurdity of the return was the shift in perception. On the way west, every mountain, river and animal was new to the Corps. The journals brimmed with wonder, even in misery. On the way east, the same landscapes inspired groans instead of admiration. What had once been majestic was now another barrier. Peaks were not symbols of discovery, but obstacles that slowed aching legs. Rapids were not tests of courage, but exhausting repetitions of danger already endured. Exploration became endurance without novelty. The march home revealed another truth. Exploration was not a clean sweep across blank maps. It was loops, delays, retracing steps, waiting for weather, waiting for diplomacy, waiting for strength to return. The Corps did not march as conquering heroes, but as survivors limping across a continent that refused to make way. Even within the Corps, tempers flared. Men quarrelled over rations, over chores, over directions. Hunting parties argued about spoils. The captains pushed for more observations, more notes, more detail. Soldiers groaned, eager only to reach familiar ground. Discovery no longer felt glorious, it felt endless. You endured without fanfare as always. While others debated, you walked. While others snapped in fatigue, you held your child close and kept your pace steady. The captains recorded your presence in their journals only sparingly, but the truth was clear in the silences. Without your resilience, their quarrels might have deepened into collapse. When at last the Corps neared the Mandan villages again, their condition shocked even those who had seen them before. The men were gaunt, their clothes in tatters, their faces aged by years of hunger and cold. Yet they were alive, carrying maps, notes, and specimens that Jefferson had demanded. The price of discovery was written on their bodies, etched into scars, carved into bones. The return to American settlements carried no parades, no immediate triumph. The Corps staggered back into a world that had moved on without them. Their journals would later be published, their discoveries celebrated, their captains hailed as heroes. But in the moment, the return felt less like victory and more like collapse. The great expedition ended not with trumpets, but with weary footsteps and the relief of surviving what should have been impossible. For Sacagawea, there was no celebration either. You returned not to monuments, but to obscurity. Your role diminished in the official record, your endurance reduced to a line here and there in journals written by men who could not have survived without you. The Corps of discovery lived, and their discoveries endured because you carried them through. That truth remains etched not in monuments, but in the reality of every mile you walked with a child against your chest and a continent pressing against your back. The end of the journey seemed final, yet discovery does not end with footsteps. What followed was the reshaping of the continent itself, as the notes, maps and journals carried eastward laid the foundation for waves of settlers who would alter the land forever. The Corps had survived, but survival had a cost not just for them, but for every community whose generosity had carried them along the way. The Corps of Discovery returned east carrying more than scars. They carried knowledge, the kind Jefferson had demanded when he sent them out. Maps drawn with startling accuracy, journals filled with notes on plants and animals, lists of tribes and languages, sketches of rivers and mountains. These pages became the most valuable cargo of the entire expedition. They survived hunger, sickness, and floods, not just to stay alive, but to deliver information that would reshape a continent. You had helped gather that knowledge with every step, every edible route pointed out, every pass remembered, every trail explained. Each moment of survival contributed to the record. Yet in the official story, your presence was shrunk down, noted politely but never fully credited. History preferred to spotlight the captains with their compasses and pens. The consequences of those pages rippled outward. Settlers followed the maps, trappers chased the rivers, and traders saw the notes about resources as invitations. The frontier was no longer an abstraction. It was charted, described, and catalogued. What had once been native homelands became destinations for waves of expansion. The generosity that had carried the core forward would soon be met with encroachment, treaties, and violence. The very survival you had made possible also opened doors to futures that carried tragedy. The journals reveal the irony. They praise the kindness of tribes who shared food, the skill of hunters who supplied meat, the knowledge of guides who carried them through mountains. Yet in those same pages, Jefferson's vision of trade and settlement flickered. These notes were not just scientific curiosity, they were the blueprint for westward expansion. Animals catalogued became resources to be harvested. Rivers described became highways for future settlers. Lands recorded became territories marked for future claims. The core returned home alive, but the world they helped describe would never be the same. Your own legacy twisted in this transformation. In later years, Sacagawea became a symbol rather than a person, polished into a tale of helpful guidance and quiet loyalty. Monuments raised in your name often emphasized your role as a companion to the captains, rather than the reality of your endurance as a young mother carrying a child through blizzards, swamps, and starvation. Your name was spelled in countless ways across the records, your identity fragmented even as it was celebrated. Close your eyes and imagine the ink drying on those journals. Lines describing Kama's route, salmon runs, and Shoshone horses. Lines that began as survival notes, but would later serve as justification for settlers, traders, and soldiers to press deeper into the same lands. Survival turned into conquest not through weapons, but through words. For the core, the return meant fame. Lewis and Clark were hailed as national heroes, their discoveries praised, their leadership immortalized. For the soldiers, it meant pay, land, and recognition. For Jefferson, it meant validation of his vision of westward expansion. For you, the outcome was quieter. You returned to obscurity. Your story filtered through the pens of men who did not always understand the scale of what you had carried. The greatest consequence of all was not the survival of the core, but the transformation of the land itself. The animals they recorded would be hunted nearly to extinction in the decades to come. Bison herds that once thundered across plains would dwindle. Salmon runs would shrink under the weight of dams and overfishing. The people who had shared food and shelter with starving men would face displacement and broken promises. The continent described in those journals was already vanishing by the time later generations read them. Yet the endurance of Sacagawea remains a thread woven through it all. Without your guidance, without your calm during capsizes, without your translations at councils, without your ability to find food in barren landscapes, much of that knowledge would have been lost with the men themselves. The core returned because you carried them, even as history tried to shrink your role into the background. The consequences written in ink are not only about discovery, they are also about erasure. Erasure of the people who had known the land for centuries, erasure of the suffering that made those discoveries possible, erasure of your endurance. Yet those truths linger beneath the monuments, waiting for voices to retell them. The expedition was ending, but the story was not. What followed after the return was the reshaping of memory itself, where Sacagawea's presence became mythologized, her endurance reduced to symbol, her reality hidden beneath layers of patriotic narrative. The frontier does not care what you're wearing. Rain soaks through buckskin, prairie thorns shred leggings, and frost turns leather stiff as wood. Yet you cannot walk naked across a continent, so every step of the expedition becomes a war with your own clothing. You quickly learn that what begins as a neat uniform or a sturdy moccasin will end as a damp, foul-smelling rag clinging desperately to your body. Start with the shoes. Moccasins, soft-soled and comfortable, are perfect for hunting quietly on short trips. They're not perfect for wading through endless rivers, tramping across thorny plains, or climbing jagged mountains. The Corps of Discovery wore through them at astonishing speed. Lewis and Clark's journals mention men burning through multiple pairs in a matter of weeks. By the time the expedition neared the Rockies, they had worn out hundreds of pairs. Some soldiers tried patching them with rawhide, others stuffed grass inside for padding. The result was always the same: soaked, stiff, and falling apart. The problem was not just inconvenience. Bare feet meant infection. Step on a sharp branch, slice open your heel, and suddenly you were limping behind the group with no doctor beyond folk remedies and prayers. Frostbite was worse. Without insulation, toes blackened in the cold, and the frontier made no allowance for delays. If you could not walk, you slowed the expedition. And if you slowed the expedition too much, you risked being left behind. Clothing did not fare better. Soldiers began in wool and linen, but by mid-journey most garments had been patched, repatched, and reduced to rags. Shirts became translucent with wear, trousers ripped at the seams, and cloaks hung heavy with mildew. Washing them was a luxury rarely attempted. Rivers were not laundromats, and soap was scarce. Dirt, sweat, grease, and smoke from campfires layered onto fabric until the smell announced your arrival before you spoke. Sacagawea knew better than most how to adapt. Indigenous clothing styles were designed for the realities of the land. Animal hides, treated and smoked, provided warmth that wool could not. Fringes were not decoration but drainage, helping rain run off. Leggings laced tightly against burrs and brush. Still, even her expertise could not stop leather from stiffening like stone when frozen, or from reeking when wet for too long. Imagine trying to sleep inside a fur cloak that smells like the back end of a wet elk. Comfort was not on offer. Headgear was its own comedy. Tricorn hats may have looked smart back east, but on the prairie they blew away in gales or sagged with rain. Soldiers improvised, tying strips of cloth around their heads or fashioning crude caps from animal skin. One journal mentions a man wearing a hat stitched from otter hide, which sounds luxurious until you imagine the greasy, fishy odour clinging to it in summer heat. And then there were the lice. Once they infested your clothing, there was no escape. They nestled into seams, multiplied in collars, and survived every attempt at boiling or smoking them out. Some soldiers shaved their heads to keep lice from crawling into their hair. Others simply scratched constantly, red lines tracing their arms and necks like an angry map. You could not outrun them. They were as much a part of your wardrobe as the buttons. The smell was indescribable. Picture a mixture of wet leather, sour sweat, campfire smoke, unwashed wool, and the faint tang of mercury powder carried for medicine. Now imagine that smell not for a day, not for a week, but for months. That was the perfume of discovery. When the Corps of Discovery encountered native tribes, one has to wonder what the host thought as the men trudged into camp, eyes hollow, clothes tattered, and bodies stinking like rancid hides. Diplomacy likely began with holding one's breath. There was also the issue of vanity. These were still men after all, and men occasionally wanted to look respectable. Lewis wrote about the difficulty of maintaining appearances when his best uniform was ragged and his stockings had been eaten away by thorns. Clark too lamented the lack of presentable clothing when meeting chiefs. They patched what they could, polished buttons, and tried to present themselves as dignified emissaries of the United States. But dignity is hard to project when your trousers are falling apart at the seams. Winter magnified every problem. Animal hides provided warmth, but they were heavy, unwieldy, and soaked through in snow. Gloves wore out, leaving fingers cracked and bleeding. Blankets froze stiff. Soldiers huddled in whatever layers they could assemble, teeth chattering, while frost formed on their eyebrows. The cold crept in anyway, reminding them that survival had less to do with courage and more to do with whether your moccasins could keep your toes attached. It is easy to romanticize the image of frontiersmen wrapped in buckskin, striding nobly across the wilderness. The reality was far less noble. It was clothing that chafed, reeked, froze, and rotted. It was a daily gamble between suffocating in heat and freezing in cold. It was waking each morning to find your shoes had stiffened into boards overnight, forcing you to stamp them into submission before walking another mile. And through it all, Sacagawea carried her infant, wrapped in furs that she had to keep dry despite rain, snow, and endless mud. Her ability to adapt her clothing and create warmth from what the land offered kept her child alive. The Corps, for all their bravado, leaned heavily on her knowledge of what worked and what did not. Clothing in the end was not just fabric, it was survival itself, and the frontier had no sympathy for rags. But if dressing each day felt like a punishment, what you ate next could be worse. For the expedition, food was never simply a meal. It was a gamble, a challenge, and often a stomach-turning ordeal waiting to happen. Congratulations, you've survived another ridiculous corner of history without losing any toes. Probably. If you want to hear what other bizarre torments history has in store, drop a comment telling me what time it is where you're listening, and what disaster you want me to cover next. Do you prefer medieval peasants spooning chickens, Egyptian tomb builders living on beer and back pain, or maybe something even stranger? Your suggestions keep this channel marching along like the core of Discovery, with slightly less diarrhea. And before you drift off, check out the other History for Sleep journeys waiting on this channel. Each one is a different kind of misery, softened into a cozy bedtime story just for you. Like, subscribe, and let the algorithm know you want more of this absurd time travel. Now close your eyes, ignore the sound of mosquitoes circling in the dark, and rest easy, because tomorrow we dive into another disaster you're lucky never to have lived through. The Corps of Discovery returned east alive, their maps and journals spread out across desks in Washington, their leaders celebrated in speeches and newspapers. For Jefferson, it was proof that his vision of the young nation stretching from ocean to ocean was not fantasy. For the soldiers, it was pay and parcels of land. For Lewis and Clark, it was fame and history's embrace. For you, the return meant obscurity. Your name appeared in the journals, often spelled differently each time, as if even your identity was a puzzle to the men who depended on you. They noted your calm during the capsizing boat, your voice at the Shoshone Council, your foraging skills, your endurance. But the records were fragments, observations on the margins of discovery. What followed in the years after your death was a slow transformation. Sacagawea became less a person and more a story. A teenage girl who carried a child across the continent turned into a bronze statue, a face on a dollar coin, a classroom figure praised for guidance and loyalty. The grit, hunger and suffering disappeared. The accidents, the mosquitoes, the endless exhaustion, all of it smoothed into a symbol of cooperation and peace. The reality of survival was erased in favour of myth. The myth grew in layers. Early writers emphasised your loyalty to Lewis and Clark, painting you as a faithful guide rather than a woman navigating her own survival. Later accounts turned you into a symbol of women's contribution to history, a face used in campaigns for suffrage, a reminder that endurance had always shaped nations. In the 20th century you became an icon of native resilience, though often in ways that simplified and distorted your life. Each generation reshaped you to fit its own needs, polishing the story until the real person vanished beneath it. The truth was never so tidy. You were kidnapped as a child, forced into marriage, and drafted into an expedition that demanded your knowledge but rarely honoured your cost. You carried an infant across landscapes that broke hardened soldiers. You survived sickness, starvation, and cold. You translated, negotiated, and foraged. You salvaged supplies when panic set in. Without you, the Corps might have been erased by rivers or mountains long before reaching the Pacific. Your legacy was not loyalty, it was endurance. It was the strength of a woman whose presence alone steadied fragile diplomacy, whose hands gathered roots that kept men alive, whose calm preserved the very records that became the backbone of discovery. Yet the symbol created after you bore little resemblance to the person who lived through it. Close your eyes and imagine the way statues depict you. Hair neatly braided, gaze steady, child wrapped peacefully against you, as if the journey had been noble and serene. Now set that image beside the truth. You, soaked by endless rain at Fort Clatsop, covered in mosquito bites on the Missouri, half-starved in the Bitterroots, steadying a canoe while men panicked, your child crying into your chest while you foraged roots to keep both of you alive. The reality is harsher, messier, but also far more human than the bronze allows. The core of Discovery's legacy reshaped the continent. Settlement, trade, and expansion followed. The maps became highways for migration. The journals became justification for treaties and conquests. The animals' catalogues dwindled, the rivers dammed, the tribes displaced. Your role became part of that history, not as a voice but as a symbol, invoked without always being understood. Your endurance remains undeniable, even if history has tried to soften it. You were not simply a guide. You were the lifeline of an expedition that might have collapsed into another story of failure. Your survival carried them across a continent. Your presence turned strangers into allies. Your knowledge filled gaps their instruments could not. You were not a side note. You were the spine of the story. As the Corps reached the end of its journey, their maps inked and their bodies broken, they returned to a world that celebrated discovery while forgetting dependence. But the memory of you lingers in every line of their journals, in every moment where survival hung by a thread and you steadied it. The myth of Sacagawea will always shift with the needs of those who tell it, but the truth remains beneath. A teenage mother who endured hunger, illness, rivers, mountains and politics, carrying both a child and an expedition across the raw edges of a continent. A woman turned into a symbol, but who was always more than symbol.